Graphic Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, MK Serwick. On today's show, Toronto-based medical illustrator and 2012 Graphic Medicine Conference host Shelley Wall, plus graphic medicine news, so stay tuned. Before we begin the show, I want to tell you that support for the podcast comes from Penn State's College of Medicine, Department of Humanities, the nation's oldest humanities department within a medical school, pioneers of innovations in medical education since 1967. To learn more about Penn State College of Medicine, Department of Humanities, go to www.med.psu.edu/humanities. Okay, first up is graphic medicine news. The call for papers from the 2018 Graphic Medicine Annual Conference is out. As you may know, we will be hosted by the Center for Cartoon Studies in White River Junction, Vermont, and we would love to hear from you. So I will put a link to the call for papers and conference details in the show notes. Please join us in Vermont. It's also easy to find the conference information if you go to www.graphicmedicine.org. The deadline for proposals is January 30th. Next item of news is This Week in Graphic Medicine. I'm excited to remind everyone that graphic medicine informational guru Matthew No's This Week in Graphic Medicine posts now appear on the Graphic Medicine site rather than on his own blog. And we're thrilled with this development, not just because Matthew's work in the last year has been so amazing, and we are very grateful. We're thrilled because his work has created a rich archive on the site of all graphic or medicine-related news and events. And we really didn't have that before, and it's what we've always wanted the site to be. So once again, yay, Matthew. If you'd like to get these weekly posts delivered right to your inbox as an email, just subscribe to the posts on the site in the right-hand margin. And then final piece of news I have is podcast episode update. Due to heavy graphic medicine workload as well as related book release travel schedule, it's been difficult for me to get episodes of the podcast edited and posted, so thank you for your patience. My hope is that during the holidays I'll have more time to edit and work on more episodes. Particularly the keynotes from the Seattle conference is what I'm going to focus on first. So watch for those episodes. They're going to be great. Also, if there are any presentations that you're particularly eager to hear, or if you presented and would love an episode to feature your work, please be in touch and we can work together to make that happen. This week's episode will feature the work of Dr. Shelley Wall. In September, Dr. Wall gave the opening address of the Hiram College Graphic Medicine series, and we're really excited that Shelley and her hosts at Hiram have been kind enough to record and share that talk with us. It's titled Medical Illustration and the Language of Comics. If you'd like to learn more about Hiram College's ongoing graphic medicine series, look for that link in the show notes. I hope you enjoyed Dr. Shelley Wall's wonderful talk.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm Erin Lamb, Director of Hiram College's Center for Literature and Medicine, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the first event in a year-long series sponsored by the Center on Graphic Medicine. The series will include 2 more keynote talks, 5 graphic medicine workshops, and a graphic medicine competition open to the public with cash prizes. Please look on the back of your programs or visit www.hiram.edu/graphicmed for more information about these events. Now, if you happen to be wondering just what is graphic medicine, well, you are in luck. We have an amazing speaker tonight who, among making many other connections for us, will offer us a sense of graphic medicine as a field. I'm honored to introduce our speaker, Dr. Shelley Wall. She is, if I may say so very Hiram. By that I mean that she has followed her passions and combined many disciplines in order to do very innovative and meaningful work. She started out with a PhD in English from McMaster University, studying romantic literature. From Keats and Shelley, she moved on to earn a 4-year degree in drawing and painting from the Ontario College of Art and Design. This was followed by a Master of Science in Biomedical Communications from the University of Toronto, the program in which she now teaches. She's worked as a medical illustrator in a hospital setting, developing animations and materials to explain, for instance, to children how their kidneys function, or to new parents what an intersex condition is and what kinds of natural variation we see in children's sexual differentiation. She's currently the inaugural illustrator in residence in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto. She teaches graduate courses in pathological illustration, research methods in biomedical communications, and graphic medicine, as well as undergraduate courses in bioscientific visualization and writing for healthcare. Tomorrow at noon, in the Pritchard Room of the library, Dr. Wall will be offering our first graphic medicine workshop on exploring point of view in graphic medicine. While this will be a hands-on workshop, no drawing skill is required. While we did require pre-registration, we can likely accommodate a few more participants, so if you have not registered but would like to, please see me after the talk tonight. Tonight, Dr. Wall will be speaking to us about the intersections of all these fascinating fields that have captivated her in a talk titled Medical Illustration and the Language of Comics. Please join me in a warm round of applause to welcome Dr. Shelley Wall.
Thank you, Erin, for that very gracious and extensive introduction, exposing my entire checkered past. It's just, I've only been here 24 hours, and it's just been a great pleasure to be in Hiram and meet the people at Hiram and the faculty and the students and just the people who live in the town. It's been a real pleasure so far. It's a great honor to be here and to be sharing this bill with Tiva Harrison and M.K. Serwick, who are doing the talks later in the year, and I think with them you will really get to the beating heart of graphic medicine. A lot of what this is a talk that's sort of in two parts. I'm going to talk a bit about medical illustration because I think I take it for granted, and I know there are two people in the audience who are very familiar with medical illustration as a profession and as a field of training. But I think for some people it's a little unfamiliar. Talk about that, talk about how visual storytelling is really the bridge between what I trained to do professionally and what I have now found myself doing personally and also in my pedagogy. And so I'll conclude with some thoughts about graphic medicine and some images. So, from medical graphics to graphic medicine is the title that I've added to this since the program was printed. I want to start, not to draw attention to all the letters after my name, but to kind of disambiguate what all those letters are for, because that identifies some of the interdisciplinary aspects of where I'm coming from and what I'm going to be talking about. So, CMI stands for Certified Medical Illustrator. It's a board certification that professional medical illustrators go through, and for some years after I graduated, I worked as a medical illustrator at the Hospital for Sick Children, as Erin has said, as Dr. Lamb has said. I don't know if you're on first name basis or how you function at Hiram. All my students just call me Shelley. So then the MSc BMC, that's the Master of Science in Biomedical Communication. It's the professional graduate program in which I teach and where I graduated after studying art and English. And then the PhD is where my interest in the humanities side of medical humanities comes in, because I spent a lot of my life, of my adult life, reading the works of Keats and Shelley. John Keats, English Romantic poet, died at the age of 26 of tuberculosis, was a trained medical doctor, and a lot of his poetry was informed by his study of medicine in late 18th, early 19th century London. So medical illustration, a lot of people, when they think of medical illustration, they think of images like this. Leonardo da Vinci, Renaissance man, who actually inaugurated a lot of the visual conventions that we still use to talk about the body. This different, like using an axially symmetrical image, splitting it two ways, using the two halves to demonstrate different levels of dissection. Vesalius is in the center. Who here knows about Vesalius? Yes, the art historian knows. Vesalius was the anatomist who, in the middle of the 16th century, in 1543, he published an absolute watershed book in the history of anatomical illustration. His was the first book, illustrated by artists from the studio of the Renaissance artist Titian, who actually looked really closely at the human body rather than, this is a very cant history of medical illustration, but rather than repeating kind of ideas that had been circulated for literally 1,000 years about how the body functioned. He actually dissected bodies, looked at them, had his artists illustrate them, and created this book called De Humani Corporis Fabrica in 1543. And if you study anything about medicine, the history of medicine, the history of anatomy, that is one of the key books. And then this one on the right is from a anatomical and surgical atlas of the 19th century. I think an early example of color lithography, of color printing in anatomical illustration by Jean-Baptiste Bourgeaby, was the anatomist, and Nicolas his artist. And this book was interesting because it was very explicitly idealizing. He selected a 33-year-old male and talks about how he wanted to promote this idea of human beauty in actually talking about human anatomy and surgical procedures. Surgical procedures at a time when there was no anesthetic, which is interesting because this is a complete digression, but when you see the surgical illustrations in this atlas, you see images of the hands that are holding the patient down because the patient is still awake and being operated on. So these are some historical images. When I first started to study medical illustration, I thought, oh, I'm going to spend my life doing just drawing beautiful red chalk drawings of the human body like Da Vinci. Well, no, that's not what it turns out to be. Although, beautiful illustrations like this are still made. But people say, well, can't you just take a picture now? I'm going to show you a picture of a surgical procedure. This is brain surgery. And if you're studying brain surgery, if you're a surgical or neurosurgical resident, and you're trying to, if you're trying to figure out what you're looking at, maybe you can. If you're not a neurosurgical resident, it's just blancmange. It's just like pudding. So that's why that's one example of why you need illustrators to actually clarify information, to make that selection, to make sense of what is being seen. So photographs are not really the way to go in a lot of cases. Another thing people say is, hasn't everything been drawn already? When I worked at Sick Kids, and I was, working away at my desk in the open concept office every day, and I was creating images, and so were the other people I worked with. And one day I shared an elevator with a senior administrator who worked on that floor, and he said, I've seen, what do you do? And I said, oh, well, I work with these other people, and we create medical illustrations and animations for kidshealth.ca, the website. He said, well, don't you just get all these pictures off the net? And I won't even start to go in here to issues of copyright here, but no, not everything has been drawn already. Even things like human anatomy for textbooks needs to be reimagined, it needs to be redrawn, it needs to be taken out of copyright, it needs to be updated. But there's new information, there's just this explosion of information in cell and molecular biology, genomics. There's lots of new research to visualize. And so in doing that, medical illustrators have to think of ways to visualize what has never been seen before in a lot of cases. David Goodsell is a molecular biologist and very accomplished artist who does the Molecule of the Month at the Protein Data Bank. There are new contexts, there are new audiences. 100 years ago, patient education wasn't a thing, and now it's really important to educate patients about their choices, their conditions. There's education at all levels: children, undergrads, residents, the public, museums. And there's new media. So New media like animation, interactive media, simulations, mobile apps, serious games, augmented reality, virtual reality. And this new media is actually changing the way we interact with visual information. And so medical illustrators, among others, are trying to find new ways to harness that media to come up with the best way to interact with that information and find out, glean the most from it. So new information, cell and molecular biology, big data, information visualization of massive data sets like the human genome is a lot of what people like us do. There are new technologies that have to be explained, new therapies, new surgical procedures, new pharmaceuticals with different mechanisms of action, new contexts and audiences, patient education, public health, global health, new media, as I mentioned, all of these different, and this list is probably going to change tomorrow because there's always something new coming down the pipe. So the biomedical, so that's the sort of CMI part. That's what medical illustrators do in a really small nutshell these days. So the BMC program equips students to take on these kinds of roles. It's a 2-year professional Master of Science program. I have some information about it if anybody thinks this might be interesting to them, because it's very interdisciplinary, art and science and communication. It's classified, it's accredited as an allied health profession. Our degree comes from the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto. We have 18 students per year, most of them coming as science graduates, but not all of them. There's a small number of science prerequisites. And it's one of only 4 such programs in North America. For you here in the States, there's a program at UIC in Chicago, there's a program at Johns Hopkins, and which was the very first. That's where this field as a distinct educational program was founded. And there's one at Augusta Regents in Georgia. So just a little bit about our students' training. It's in order to illustrate things or to visualize things accurately and in a way that is going to communicate best to your audience and to serve your client, you need to really understand what it is you're illustrating, which is why graphic designers, illustrators, people who are really good artists aren't necessarily good medical illustrators, because you have to really understand your subject matter. And so one of the things that our students do is they start by doing a full cadaver dissection. They do months worth of gross anatomy. Our students used to do it with medical students, now they have a dedicated program, but they go into the anatomy lab with donated human cadavers every day and dissect them and observe them and learn about them. And we encourage them to look really closely, to do a lot of drawings, rather than just memorizing lists of muscles and innervation, etc. Because when you're looking at something really closely, you see things that you wouldn't even actually perceive unless you were trying to draw them. So these are examples from a student's book, a sketchbook. But in addition to that kind of traditional observation, doing that deep observation and research, our students are also doing really cutting-edge things with technology as well. There's a really big digital technology component to our program. This is an example. This is a very short clip, but this is actually a simulation from quite some time ago, over 10 years ago now, where Maya, it's a 3D modeling program used in Hollywood, was programmed with different algorithms that would replicate the movement of cells, particularly fibroblast cells, who are responsible in tissue repair, how they moved through a tissue scaffold that was like the kind of graft that would be used in creating skin grafts for burn victims. And so how did the cells move through that particular architecture? And so this was all built in 3D, and then the cells were programmed. These weren't animated. It wasn't like someone said, okay, now that cell goes here. But they were programmed with the kind of parameters that would constrain those cells. And then they just let the program run, and so they could see virtually how those cells would move through a skin graft scaffold. And that was actually part of biomedical research, that would help them to determine the best kind of architecture for skin grafts. And one of our students was involved in creating this simulation. This is an example of augmented reality. So if you think of textbooks, our students still, they go out in the workforce, they illustrate textbooks, but this was an experimental project where a student actually thought about the cochlea, part of the inner ear, responsible for hearing, how it's a very difficult structure to visualize, and she thought, how could you use augmented reality to actually enhance the experience of using a textbook? So this is an example of someone using the iPad app that she created to work with a textbook image. All of these clips are just 30 or 40 seconds long. So, textbook image, and it has this sort of glyph, and so the app can map onto this glyph, and it can show you this three-dimensional representation of what's inside that negative space that's represented in the picture. And our students also they do illustrations as well, but of new research, photoswitchable proteins, so harnessing particular photosensitive proteins that exist in nature and using them to tag certain molecules and cells in research. So this is a really an example of using three-dimensional data from the protein data bank, but also visual storytelling. So leading the reader really clearly through this process, what's going on inside the cell, who the different players are, and I'm going to talk about visual storytelling a bit more as we go on. The CRISPR mechanism, you've probably heard a lot about that. I know I'm a colleague in the medical humanities field who is very interested. She's an English scholar, but very interested in how new biotechnologies are affecting how we think about our own human existence. She just recently bought a new dog, and its name is CRISPR, which seems like a great name for a dog. Surgical illustration. This is an example of new procedures need to be explained. There's a lot of different storytelling elements going on in this. It's just two pictures, but you can see here these lines that are anticipating where this is a knee replacement. So where do the condyles of the femur need to be cut? This arrow here indicating where this new replacement joint is going to be slotted in. Close up here in cross section, so giving you a sort of different perspective on the information. So all of these elements of storytelling are telling you different stages and giving you different perspectives on the surgery in a single image. I have quite a few illustrations from Pathology Illustration, because that's one of the courses I teach, where the point is to do something that would be appropriate for like a popular science magazine. So an educated lay audience. This isn't for researchers, but it's explaining a disease process to people who are interested in sort of getting a bit more information about things like osteoporosis that so many of us or our parents or our grandparents end up living with. It's a funny course to teach, because when I'm assigning topics, the students are coming to me and saying things like, does anyone have tuberculosis yet? I want tuberculosis. You can't have tuberculosis, but you can have a bladder infection. And then they go and illustrate that. But here too, very clear sort of sequential storytelling. This is the way the different cell populations break down and then resorb all the different stages in normal bone architecture, and then the much more diminished architecture in osteoporosis. And then another kind of information is the sort of clinical information. How does this affect the human person who is affected, who has this going on at the cellular level in her bones? Patient education. This is, again, an example of new audiences. This was specifically a handbook that was made for newcomer women, so women who had recently either emigrated or arrived as refugees in Toronto. There's a very large population there who have a very particular kind of interaction with the healthcare system in Toronto, and specifically for women who were HIV positive and had mental health issues. So a very, very particular population, and there were things that the artist had to think about, like these women might not have disclosed their HIV status, they might not want to be looking things up on the internet in the library, they might not want like a big brochure that they would have to carry around that said HIV on the cover. So it was a very discreet, it was a small book that was specifically designed so that women could put it in their purse or in their pocket. It could be very discreet. It didn't say, it was called Taking Care of My Body and Mind, so it sort of emphasized positive mental health rather than HIV status. And it was done in the form of storytelling, so kind of like comics, conversations between women and their caretakers, and introduced the different members of their care team. Another example of pathology illustration, glaucoma. So all sorts of different scales of information represented here. The sort of overview. This is the normal, the sort of typical healthy anatomy, architecture of the eye, the architecture of the eye typically, and then glaucoma, and then the different stages of the disease as the optic cut, where the optic nerve leaves the eye, where it's actually being kind of degraded by increased pressure. So a lot of different sequential storytelling going on here. And this is a clip for sort of public health outreach, which is another big thing that our students do. This is part of a much longer clip, but it was from a couple of years ago when it was really important to encourage people to get their flu shot.
You might have heard about the swine flu, or the bird flu, or H1N1, H3N2, and a whole pile of other names. But what does it all mean? The flu is a viral illness that can range from mild to severe, and is usually transmitted through coughing or sneezing, which spreads droplets carrying this, the influenza virus. 3 types of flu viruses can infect humans: A, B, and C. A viruses are divided into subtypes, with some infecting humans and others infecting animals such as pigs and birds. These viruses are named after their endoprotein spikes called hemagglutinin and neuraminidase, better known as the H's and the N's. These structures play an important role in virus infection.
So how many of you knew that that's what the H and the N stood for in like H1N1? Did you? Okay. Some people. So what goes into a successful medical visualization? And I'm saying visualization rather than illustration, because as you can see now, it's a much broader spectrum of visual communication. So close observation when it's things you can see, careful research even when it's things you can actually observe, or things that can only be imagined, like molecular events. Very deep understanding of the subject matter. Sensitivity to audience needs. So researchers who want to learn about, how to use a new kind of imaging technology have very different learning styles. They're in a different context than, say, a patient who has low health literacy, low literacy, maybe is not fluent in English, who's just been diagnosed with something, who is under a lot of stress. So you have to communicate in a very different way to different audiences. You have to consider what's the medium that's available, what's the most appropriate venue for this kind of information. Technical expertise, our students do a lot of learning about programming, different graphics technologies. And above all, and that's where the kind of hinge to talking about comics comes in, is it's good storytelling. Good visual storytelling is really the key to what we do and what we try to encourage in our students. I love, this image is actually from a graduating student's presentation, where instead of talking about her research, she was actually doing an animation. It was a paleontological reconstruction of a very particular kind of tooth growth in some ancient pre-reptile. But what she talked about was really the importance of storytelling, and how all of the technical stuff that really causes a lot of stress and a lot of sleepless nights in our students is just, it's embraced by storytelling, which is really the big picture, and that's what people are learning. in learning to be medical illustrators. These are just a couple of terms from narratology, so the study of the structure of narrative. You don't have to worry about that. But I find this a really useful description. Mika Ball said, the fabula is just a series of events that make up the raw material for a story. So it's just this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. And then what you do is, to make the story, is you select, you emphasize certain things, you de-emphasize certain other things, you figure out how you're going to pace your story, and you create a narrative out of that raw material. So an example would be, these are, you don't have to read this, this is just a clip from a description of what's necessary to, all the steps you have to go through in performing coronary artery bypass grafts. So, how do you establish the site? How do you harvest the graft? All of that. So this is sort of the raw material. This goes on for pages. And then out of that, when someone is doing a surgical illustration, they have to make a very selective, decide, okay, which parts of the story need to be illustrated? Where do I need to direct the focus? Whose point of view is this? So this is the surgeon's point of view. But then at some points it's sort of drawn back and it's a more kind of diagrammatic point of view. So which point of view is appropriate for which point in the story? How do you pace the information? Where do you place the emphasis? What is it important to put into the captions? How do you combine image and text? So to create a story out of data. Another example of visual storytelling, meningoencephalitis. So this is an infection in the linings that surround the brain. So the title here, this is a little bit about page layout, and we talk a lot about layout and composition in our classes, but this is so here's the cryptococcus, so here's the virus that is causing it. So it sort of leads you down from the title into this human character, so you kind of embody the information in a relatable person who has this disease. You can see a little bit of her anatomy here, and then you're led over here through these step 1, 2, 3, this sort of sequential illustration of the progress of the disease. And then here, kind of close up, that gives you a little more detail about what's going on at the level of the vessels in the meninges. And even something like this, that, if you study biology, you see diagrams like this in your textbooks all the time. This is visual storytelling. It flows from left to right. You have characters who are interacting in a certain way. There's a temporal sequence. This is the cell membrane, so that's your setting. But there's also a temporal sequence that moves from left to right to understand this particular pathway. So remember this guy? So this is one of the dissected cadavers from Vesalius. This was only discovered, so Vesalius, the book was published in 1543, and I think it was only in the 20th century that someone figured out that if you looked at a series of these illustrations, they're called the muscle men, and you put them together, there's actually a continuous landscape along the back. They're not together in the book, they're separated by a few pages between them. So there's a continuous landscape, which they've actually identified as an identifiable, so a landscape of Tuscany. And it actually tells a story. So you start with this guy here, and then it reads backwards, and they gradually get more and more dissected until by the end you've got this poor fellow who has to lean against a wall to stand up, because even though they're all dead from the beginning because they're being dissected, some of them actually have enough muscles to stand with near the beginning. So it's telling a story. There's a kind of whimsy in that, even though people didn't know that for centuries. So given that idea of sequential storytelling, arranging things in the temporal sequence, choosing moments from the story, working with image and text, it's a little bit like comics. And so Scott McCloud, who wrote Understanding Comics, which is one of the, in comic form, great didactic books talking about how comics work, defines comics as juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and or produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. Which, as a pretty generic description, is actually a pretty good description of a lot of medical illustration. But that is the hinge that brings me to graphic medicine, which is actually the name of the series, and I've been talking for half an hour and I'm only getting to it now. But I think that's all sort of important background to tell you where I'm coming from. And as I said, you know, your next two speakers are really going to talk a lot more about how this relates to patient experience and caregiver experience. But I'll talk a little bit about that now. So graphic medicine is a term that was coined by a physician and scholar, Ian Williams, about 10 years ago to describe the intersection of the medium of comics and the discourse of healthcare. This is a page from a scholarly book, partly in comic form, called the Graphic Medicine Manifesto, by M.K. Serwick. There she is. She's going to be talking to you. Ian Williams. Michael Green is a physician and humanities scholar, and he teaches at Hiram College in Pennsylvania. And Susan Squire is not a chicken, but she uses a chicken as her avatar. She's a humanities scholar, also from Penn State. So these definitions are, I'll just read them. Graphic medicine combines the principles of narrative medicine with an exploration of visual systems of comic art, interrogating the representation of physical and emotional signs and symptoms within the medium. So it's kind of a deliberately, I actually heard an interview with Ian Williams, a podcast recently, where he said, I was deliberately kind of vague in coming up with this definition because it is a very broad field. So the most directly related instance of comics and medical illustration is just didactic comics, so comics that are meant just to teach, to convey information in patient education, in public outreach. So to raise awareness about certain conditions or different kinds of research, to prepare patients, for example, for a procedure, or teach them how to use, how to give their own insulin injection or something, promote management of chronic conditions, so promote good health behavior. Comics are non-threatening, they're accessible for patient education, they can often transcend language barriers, they're good for children, they can help bridge kind of literacy and communication barriers. Just a few examples. This is from a couple of physician and artist, Alex Thomas and Gary Ashwell, did Booster Shot comics, which they've really built up into quite a very vibrant franchise. And they create superhero comics for kids with asthma, to teach them about their asthma, teach them about the different kind of inhalers that they have to use. So they have little Iggy and the Inhalers is the name of the series, so little characters who interact with the architecture of the lungs and explain what asthma is. So it's very fun, there are coloring activities and things. This is a slightly different use of comics. David Lasky for Seattle and King County Public Health this is just an excerpt, but a short narrative about the Great Flu Epidemic of 1918. Millions of people, more people died, I think, in that flu epidemic than had died in the First World War, which had just preceded it. And so this was a few years ago when people were very worried about a new flu pandemic that would be back, resistant to treatment coming around. And so it was a comic that kind of brought that historical awareness of the damage done by that flu into the present, and then led into public health information about how to prepare in case of a flu pandemic, how to keep yourself safe from infection, and what to do if you became ill. And this was, I teach a graduate course in comics and medicine for my students in the medical illustration program. And for them, it's sort of it's a chance for them to let their freak flag fly. I just say, do whatever you want, explore your own style, choose your own story. It could be didactic or it could be personal. Just, find your own kind of visual voice. And this student, she was working with a children's rehabilitation hospital in Toronto. She was doing a research project there. And so she took a blog post by a 12-year-old kid who was a long-term resident in this rehab hospital. He had a chronic condition, he'd spent a lot of time as an inpatient, and he had written tips for kids to keep from, feeling down when you're in hospital. So she created this comic called Super Doctor Man, and she kind of took all the things that the kids said that this boy said you have to watch out for, and she boiled them down into these three characters: pain and blue and homesick. And then she had different sort of ways to combat these monsters. But it was she made it into a nice little sort of hand-sized comic that could be passed out to kids at the rehab hospital. So those are health information. It's like, here are some tips, this is information that you need. But this is I found this an interesting kind of transition to the next thing I'm going to talk about. Sarah McNichol, a scholar of graphic medicine, says health information comics have the potential to do much more than simply convey facts about an illness. They also support patients in dealing with the social and psychological aspects of the condition. And so that's what I want to move into now. And these things it's not like you can say, okay, these are discrete categories. But I want to talk a little bit more about the second part. So how the affective, the emotional dimension of stories in medicine. So if you have information comics, it's just here's a story that makes it easy to kind of absorb and process this information that is necessary to have. Another area of graphic medicine is graphic memoirs, where people who are caregivers, or healthcare professionals, or patients, or survivors of illness, or family members, write memoirs to talk about what it's like to live through that, or to live with that. And I don't actually know, I wasn't sure what kind of visual to have here, because I'm not sure if it's a Venn diagram, I'm not sure if it's a spectrum, or if it's just a really crazy network, but there's a lot of different things that are encompassed in the field of graphic medicine that kind of relate to each other, but actually have quite different properties. So telling stories about illness and caregiving, a graphic memoir, is sort of the next phase of my talk, the next and final. And so these are often nonfiction comics by, as I said, survivors, patients, family members, caregivers, healthcare professionals. And according to Ian Williams, this is a list that he's published on graphicmedicine.org, which is a great website for all sorts of information about this interdisciplinary field. They can reflect or change cultural perceptions of medicine, convey the subjective patient, carer, or provider experience, enable discussion of difficult subjects against that sort of accessibility, the way narrative can ease us into difficult topics, and can help other patients or caregivers by sharing stories, because it's really important to feel you're not alone if, your mom has cancer, or your child has been diagnosed with something terrible. You want to know that other people are going through it and sort of share experiences with them. So this idea of conveying the subjective patient or subjective experience, those who are in Lisa Safford's class today, I talked in a different context about the difference between the kind of objective medical information and then what it actually feels like to live through that. And graphic medicine, this is another aspect of capturing that subjective experience. This is just a shout out to the two people who are going to be talking later in the year. M.K. Serwick wrote this comic, which was about being a nurse in an AIDS unit at the height of the epidemic in Chicago in the 90s. It's an amazing book. Tiva Harrison, who was also from Toronto. I don't know her, sadly, but we're from the same town. Has written this book about living with terminal cancer. So she'll be talking about that. So I'm not going to talk about these, but these are the examples of the kind of work that is out there. Just a couple of examples from sort of within my own circle. This is one of my students. Some years ago, as I said, they do a full cadaver dissection. It's a rite of passage for medical students as well. You walk into the lab, you have your body, you're going to spend months getting to know it, cutting it apart. It's very difficult. There's quite an emotional, cognitive leap that you have to make when you first walk into a place like that. And so she did, these are just excerpts from a comic called Pink, and it was about all the days that she spent with her cadaver, and they're covered, and so you start with the thorax, and then you know, gradually as you dissect different parts of the body, you unwrap them, and then toward the very end, she unwrapped the feet, and there was pink nail polish on the feet. And she said, and I've heard other people have really responded to the story and said, oh yeah, that happened to me too. Then you think, oh my God, this was a living person who got a pedicure. just days before she ended up as the cadaver that I now have the privilege to learn from. And so the whole thing is in gray until you come to this page with the pink toenails, and then it turns into this full color imagining of what the life of the cadaver was, you know, how she was a person and all and the relationships and the things that she went through. So this was posted on the anatomy website for the medical students who come in, and they're now encouraged to read this at the beginning of their gross anatomy course to remind them of what they're involved in and how they're privileged to have these cadavers, and that they're actually, you know, these were people who had full lives right up until the moment they gave their body for you to study from. This is another comic by a student. He'd been a very quiet guy, very talented, but just very hardworking, very quiet. And he did this very long comic about his mother, who they were immigrants. His parents didn't speak English very well when they moved to Canada. She had some sort of medical condition. She wasn't feeling well. She went to see the doctor. He said, oh, we'll take care of it. She went in for surgery. And this is about the day she goes in for surgery. Just in case you can't read it. My mother described the room as freezing. And she was startled how the surgeons lacked the sensitivity to prepare the surgical tools out of the patient's view. Looking at those tools, she said they looked a lot like tools used by a butcher. And this is where, you know, a picture is really worth 1,000 words. I mean, the words are there too, but the shock of this is what she sees. The story is she ended up having they gave her a hysterectomy, and she didn't understand that that's what was going to happen. So it became a very powerful comic about language barriers, communication barriers, and the really grave consequences that can come from that in healthcare. This is a sort of lighter example. This is actually a comic that I did in collaboration with a friend and colleague, Mike Sappel, who had a chronic disease. He couldn't figure out what it was. He went to a lot of different doctors. He tried homeopathy, he tried alternative medicine, he tried this and that. So it's sort of a quest narrative. He tried a lot of different things. Finally, he was diagnosed. But I specifically in this made use, and you see this in other comics, I made use of the language of medical illustration, because this is how we understand diagnoses. So here, this is, I grabbed this off the internet, there's a million of them. This is how you think about how the airways are organized. And he would have these sort of choking sensations. And this one, he's actually a historian of medicine who worked at the National Library of Medicine. And he and I had a shared research interest in these flat books. You can probably think of simple examples that you've had as a kid, where you open it up and you see the heart or the lungs or whatever inside. So I depicted him. He's sort of the medicalized subject that has been probed and prodded and anatomized, and so I depicted him as an anatomical flat doll. My last example of graphic medicine. So this is it's actually fictional, but it's still a very powerful novel called When David Lost His Voice. And this is the very first page, where the protagonist gets diagnosed with laryngeal cancer. And what's interesting to me is it starts with the doctor drawing that very typical diagram that I just showed you. And it's hard to read. It's Belgian, and so it's this sort of particular kind of European handwriting font. But he says, and that's your larynx, which is where the tumor is. And at the moment that the doctor draws the tumor in, that's when the image stops being a diagram and becomes a portrait of the individual patient. And then we go to him talking to his doctor, trying to process the information that he's being given in his diagnosis. But I like this because this is an example of how graphic medicine, it's not straightforward. It's not, here's the information. It's about taking what we think of as kind of objective illustrations and then troubling them, saying, this is one way of looking at the body, but what if it's actually, you know, what if you think about the subjective experience of the person it's describing, and then everything sort of gets weird. And so that's what this area of graphic medicine is really powerful at, is the ambiguities, the unanswered questions, the conflicts, the messiness, the clinical misunderstandings, all the kind of really the gray area of medicine that is painful and hard to quantify, and that can be interpreted in different ways, and that is going to be different for every person. And that's where comics are really powerful, because they can capture all of this, that messiness. There's a close-up of the scene I was talking about. Okay, I am wrapping up. Just getting the last few slides. So my entree into the graphic medicine community, which is, there's a conference every year, and it's this really interesting, very interdisciplinary group. There are doctors, there are scholars, there are patients, there are students, there are out-of-work cartoonists. There's every variety of person comes and meets there, and there's no kind of hierarchy, because everybody's interested in using this visual medium to talk about issues in healthcare. So this is a pretty typical medical illustration of what happens in the brain in Parkinson's disease, which is where certain neurons that are responsible for producing dopamine, which is a very important transmitter you need for your brain to work properly and to move properly, those neurons start to die off. And this is actually quite a beautiful illustration of a particular pharmaceutical therapy for those neurons, dealing with those neurotransmitters. But my husband has early onset, early onset advanced Parkinson's disease. He's had it since he was in his 30s. And so looking at that diagram, that doesn't tell me a lot about what our life was like living with his Parkinson's disease. And so I started to just draw comics. This is just a picture of different adaptations he made to the way he dressed, to make it a little easier for him to function, given the fact that sometimes he couldn't walk, sometimes he had trouble handling things. I mean, he's an eccentric guy anyway, and Parkinson's is just like, push that over the edge. But, so I did this comic. This was quite some time ago. And then I showed it to him, and he didn't really like it. And so then I added a little comic to it about me showing it to him, saying, I've made a portrait of you, sweetie. It shows the kind of things you've done to make your clothes Parkinson's functional. It's called off-label. And he says, I look a bit goofy. Could you do another one where I look cooler? And so when I put these together, I thought, oh, well, this is sort of what caregiving is like, is there's the person in the center and they're doing things, and there's me on the outside. So I'm literally, the caregiver is on the margins trying to understand what's going on with the sick person, but I can't really get inside his experience. So anyway, I presented this early work, which is still a work in progress, to one of the conferences. And it was a good way for me to try and process my understanding of what he was going through, because his only way of describing what he was living with was metaphorical. He'd say, well, it's like this or it's like that. But if you don't have this disease, you can't understand. And I'm sure that's true for every disease. If you're not living with something, it's really hard to put yourself inside the head of someone who is there. And I think comics can help the rest of us do that. And actually, since I started this, a book has come out called My Degeneration by an Alaskan cartoonist, Peter Dunlap Scholl, who also has early onset Parkinson's. And he does really incredible work talking about his experience, his frustrations, but also educating people about what it's like to live with this. And then just last piece, and I know we're going to talk about this in Erin and Rose's class tomorrow, but another thing that I've recently become interested in working with is comics about end of life. I think some of you are familiar with Roz Chasta's hilarious New Yorker cartoonist, who then last year, or a couple of years ago, came up with a memoir about caring for her very frustrating aging parents as they declined and to the end of their life. And this is a whole genre that MK and her colleague Michelle Wang have called hospice comics. So narratives about illness and specifically dying, told from a caregiver's point of view. And I mean, this sounds fairly niche, fairly morbid, but we're all going to go through it at some point. If we're lucky to live that long, if we're not the ones to go first. And these kinds of narratives really bring out the fact that illness doesn't just affect the individual, it affects their whole community and their family. The authors say illness happens not simply in a body, but also in a life. And so Chasta's really good at thinking about, what's the reality and what's the kind of storybook version of what happens to people when they become unwell. Here's what I used to think happened at the end. One day, old Mrs. McGillicuddy felt unwell, and she took to her bed. She stayed there for about 3 or 4 weeks, growing weaker by the day. One night, she developed something called a death rattle, and soon after that, she died. The end. R.I.P. old Mrs. McGillicuddy. What I was starting to understand, it was that the middle panel was sometimes a lot more painful, humiliating, long-lasting, complicated, and hideously expensive. And I think that's actually something a lot of people in my generation can identify with. And so she talks about dealing with the lawyers, trying to get her parents to talk about, they're becoming incapable of aging in their apartment, but they won't move. Her mother says, "I do not like to talk about death, and I will not talk about death." And this is a woman who is staring death, like staring down the barrel of death. When her father dies, when her mother dies, she actually doesn't draw a picture of it. She just writes about it. There's not a cartoon about her mother dying. You don't have to read this, just register the fact. It's text describing what it was like to learn that her mother had passed away. But then she says, Goody, that was her mother's personal care worker, left the room to fetch the people that one fetches when someone at the place, that's the care home, dies. While Goody was gone, I was alone with my mother's body for a while. I drew her. I didn't know what else to do. I had been drawing her all summer, since the conversations had been reduced to almost nothing. And then the last images in the book are images they're very different from her style, her cartoon style. They're pictures of her mother. And I read an interview with her saying that drawing was a way of being present. And so when you're with someone and there's you can't speak, they're in another place, or you can't speak for whatever reason. Drawing is a way of paying close attention, and this sort of comes back to really noticing what you're seeing because you're trying to draw it. And then I'll just end on a personal note. When my parents died within the last couple of years, they both died after this, long, protracted, hideous middle panel of just, endless kind of drama back and forth. This is not my father on his deathbed, but he's pretty close. And he was not conversant. He was sort of out of it, although he kind of knew I was there, but there's nothing to do. And I thought I could sit in his room for hours and I could check my phone, or I could, read a book, or I could draw, and even though we can't communicate, at least I'm paying attention to it. And so then I've started to draw pictures of what is it like when your parents die? What does it feel like? So this is the next project that I'm working on, which takes me pretty far away from my sort of day job. But what I'm hoping to do is to use drawing, cartooning to kind of reclaim it as a legitimate form of academic reflection on issues in end of life and what it means to sort of share patient and caregiver experience. So, just to come full circle, as illustrators, we take in the world through our eyes and paying close attention to things, whether it's the cadaver in the lab, whether it's the people around you, is a way of being present. As communicators, we shape our observations and knowledge into visual stories to share. And just as humans, we share stories to inform, to connect, to reflect, and to process our experiences. And I would like to thank Erin Lan and the whole college community and the Center for Literature and Medicine and everybody for your time this evening and your hospitality.
That's it for this episode of the Graphic Medicine Podcast. As always, thanks for listening. For the latest information, news stories, and event updates in graphic medicine, be sure to like our Facebook page, subscribe to the website, follow us on Twitter. Those are the best ways to stay connected to the work of the vast worldwide graphic medicine community. And once you've checked that out, don't forget to subscribe in iTunes to this podcast. And while you're there, it'd be super awesome if you could leave us a review. Coming up soon on the podcast will be more from our recent Seattle conference. It is my pleasure to one more time remind you that support for this podcast comes from the Penn State College of Medicine Department of Humanities, the nation's oldest humanities department within a medical school, pioneers of innovations in medical education since 1967. Thanks for listening, and hope you'll hear from me again soon.